So next I'll invite Dr. Martie Thompson to the podium. Dr. Thompson is a professor in the Department of Youth and Family and Community Studies and the Institute on Family and Neighborhood Life at Clemson University. Today she will be speaking on understanding the risk factors for campus sexual assault perpetration. Dr. Thompson?
Thank you so much. I'd like to echo what a lot of the people who've gone before me have said, and I'm so honored to be here. And I really thank the University of Michigan Injury Prevention Center for including me in this wonderful day of events. So the goals of my talk are to really kind of review that sexual assault is a significant public health problem among college students, to learn about the risk factors for sexual assault perpetration among college students. So turning now from Maria talked to you about risk factors for victimization, I'm going to focus more on the risk factors for perpetration. And to also understand that sexual assault perpetration risk can change during the college years. It's not necessarily a static phenomenon, like once a perpetrator, always a perpetrator. And also to understand that risk factor levels can change during the college years, and that longitudinal studies can shed light on whether these time-varying risk factors can differentiate men who follow different sexual aggression trajectories. So as we've already heard today, and everyone in this room knows, sexual assault is a significant public health problem among college students. And as Sarah's slide talked about too, it results in adverse psychological, physical, social, and educational consequences. And we also know that 20 to 25% of women experience attempted or completed rape at some point during college. Studies that have used the Sexual Experiences Survey have consistently found this rate over like 25 years of research, and 14 to 31% of male students report perpetrating sexual assault. So just a few things that we know about sexual assault among college students, and you've heard this, I think, already this morning, is that they generally know each other. Only 11% are perpetrated by strangers. The majority partner or romantic acquaintance or non-romantic acquaintances. And we also know that alcohol is involved in more than 50% of the incidents. And we've also heard today, too, that victimizations by college students are less likely to be reported to the police than non-student victimizations, based on a U.S. Department of Justice report. And then also, I think there's one thing that's been pointed out to us already today is that even though we're here talking about sexual assault on college campuses, it is a problem for non-students as well. And a Department of Justice report indicated that rape and sexual assault rates were higher for female non-students than female students, but that the opposite was the case for males. And then this slide, this is data from Dean Kilpatrick and his colleagues at the Medical University of South Carolina. And they used data from two national samples. They had a national sample of 3,000 women who were non-college students, and then a national sample of 2,000 college women. And I think these data kind of help you break it down in terms of what college students may be more at risk for. So in the yellow, it's the college student population. And you can see when you're looking at past year sexual assault, they're actually at higher risk than their non-student counterparts. And they're also at higher risk than their non-student counterparts when you're looking at drug and alcohol facilitated or incapacitated rape. So incapacitated rape is when the victim is voluntarily drinking the alcohol, and the drug and alcohol facilitated, Kilpatrick defines that as when they're giving it kind of against their knowledge or consent. And in those cases, college students have higher levels of victimization. And so what do we know about some factors that might make college students at increased risk for sexual assault? Well, it's also been pointed out it's their age. The age range of college students connotes risk. 18 to 24-year-old females have the highest rate of sexual assault victimization compared to females in all other age groups. And we also know that 80% of female victims experience their first rape before the age of 25. And we also know that there's things about the college environment, contextual factors that are happening on college that are increasing risk. This is a time that's often referred to as emerging adulthood, when college students are moving away from home. There's decreased parental monitoring. There's increased alcohol use, increased sexual activity, and also just increased exposure to different peer groups than they might have had when they were living at home. And so research that has been looking at risk factors for sexual aggression has been guided by several different theoretical frameworks. And one of the more common ones of these is the Confluence Model developed by Neil Malamuth and his colleagues that identified hostile masculinity and impersonal sex as two of the key factors that increase risk for sexual assault perpetration. And this Confluence Model has been expanded by Tony Abbey and her colleagues to look at to include alcohol use, and then also more recently by Kevin Swartout to include the concept of peer norms. Some other theories that have been applied to the study of sexual assault perpetration have been the theory of triadic influence, which proposes that it's intrapersonal, social, situational, and cultural and environmental risk factors. The theory of planned behavior, which articulates attitudes and norms and perceived control as key elements. And then the theory of emerging adulthood, which is kind of this transition from adolescence to adulthood and some of the contextual factors happening at that time point that may be increasing risk. And Sarah showed this slide. This is the CDC Social Ecological Model, a framework for prevention. And all the theories that I mentioned on the prior slide really all recognize the importance of looking at risk across these multiple ecological domains. And I think the nice thing about thinking about sexual violence using the social ecological framework is it provides a way to organize our risk factors, and also, as Sarah talked about, informing prevention efforts across these multiple domains for a comprehensive approach. And CDC published a paper led by Andra Tharp that Sarah was a co-author on that used the social ecological model, and they reviewed 191 published empirical studies that examined risk factors for sexual assault perpetration. These were not necessarily with college students, so that's just one caveat to point out. But using the social ecological framework, they identified 42 individual level risk factors that significantly increased risk for sexual assault perpetration, 23 relationship level risk factors, but only 2 societal and community level risk factors. And just to sort of orient you to this slide, the number in the denominator is the number of studies that looked at that particular risk factor, and then the number in the numerator is the number of those studies that found support for that particular risk factor and increasing risk for sexual assault perpetration. So in terms of individual level risk factors, sexual behaviors were very significant across the board. Multiple sexual partners was examined in 25 studies, and support was found for its significantly increasing risk for perpetration in 21 of those studies. Impersonal sex was a significant risk factor. Early initiation of sex, exposure to sexually explicit materials, and a motivation for sex or sex drive. And then continuing on with some of the individual level risk factors, they also looked at studies that had assessed for sexual and violence related cognitions. And again, this was one constellation of risk factors that were very significant in increasing risk for sexual assault perpetration, most notably rape myth acceptance, which was found to be significant in 31 of the 36 studies that examined this variable, and hostility towards women, which was found in 32 of the 42 studies. In terms of psychological and interpersonal individual level risk factors, the data were mixed. The 2 that really emerged as being most significant were delinquency and empathic deficits, but some of the other variables in that psychosocial and interpersonal constellation of risk factors were less significant. And then moving kind of out in the ecological framework down to out to the relationship level risk factors, they looked at peer and family and separated them out from that. And they found really strong support for peer attitudes and behaviors, a lot of significance on variables assessing those. So peer approval of forced sex, while it was only examined in 4 of the studies, it was found to be significant in all 4. Peer sexual aggression was significant in the 3 studies that looked at that variable, and peer pressure for sexual activity. And this is things like your friends don't respect someone who has never had sex, or your friends think it's important to have sex with a lot of different women. So that would be what peer pressure for sexual activity is, distinct from peer approval of forced sex. And they also found support for variables that measured association with hypermasculine or all-male peer groups, and these would be things like fraternity memberships and sports participation. And then moving out to the family relationship level factors, they found that child sexual, physical, and emotional abuse were significant risk factors for sexual violence perpetration. But family characteristics were generally not very significant, and family relationship level factors were mixed. The one that really emerged as a significant predictor was exposure to parental violence. And like I mentioned, there were not many studies that examined community and societal level risk factors, and those that did that were either not significant or had mixed support. But one of the recommendations of the CDC authors, so most of these studies that I just reviewed from this meta-review were cross-sectional in nature. And so the authors of the article recommended that more longitudinal research was needed so that we could identify trajectories of sexual assault behavior and identify risk factors for sexual assault that demonstrate temporal patterns with sexual assault. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of longitudinal research and asking 2 important research questions. Is the risk for sexual assault perpetration constant, or can it change over the course of the college years? And secondly, is risk factors for sexual assault change during college? Do these changes correspond with sexual assault risk? And so I'm going to illustrate this using some data that we've collected at my own university, at Clemson University. These data are somewhat dated. They come from 2008 to 2011. But we surveyed 800 first-year male students who did self-report surveys using the Sexual Experiences Survey, and we followed them over 4 years and re-surveyed them at the end of each of those 4 years in college. So even with longitudinal data, taking sort of a cross-sectional approach and just taking a snapshot in time of what the rates looked at across those 4 years, it looks like sexual assault perpetration is pretty stable. You can see in that top row that fortunately, the majority were non-perpetrators. 87% would be classified as a non-perpetrator their first year, about 86% their second year, 87% their third year, and 88% the fourth year. So looking like it's pretty much of a stable phenomenon. But then taking this same data set and applying a person-centered approach, and this was a study that I did with Kevin Swartout and Mary Koss using latent growth curve analysis, where you looked at each person and followed their risk over time, a different pattern emerged. And so for probably about 20% of the sample, sexual assault was time varying. The lower line, you can't really see it because it's kind of right above the x-axis, but this is the group that showed consistently low to no levels of sexual aggression across all time points, and that was about 71% of the sample. And then that top line is the consistently high group. So about 8.5% of the sample showed persistently high levels of sexual aggression across these various time points. But what's interesting is about 20% of the sample fell into these other 2 trajectory groups. The one that's starting low at the bottom and increasing was what we called the increasing risk group, and that was about 8% of the sample. These were males who came to college with low likelihood of perpetrating. They had not perpetrated before they got to college, and then over the course of their college years, they increased in their likelihood of perpetrating. And then conversely, we found a decreasing group, which was about 12.5% of the sample. These were males who came with a history of having perpetrated sexual aggression, and over the course of their college years, they decreased in their perpetration likelihood. And so we were able to show that, yes, there are different trajectories of sexual aggression. But the next question we wanted to ask was, can you predict those trajectories based on time-varying risk factors? And I was just going to show you with 3 of the risk factors that we looked at. Peer approval of forced sex. So for this, we assessed what I'm going to show you is the wave 1 at the end of their freshman year and wave 4 at the end of their senior year. And just to orient you to this slide, the green line is, I hope y'all can see that, is the low-risk group. So you can see that they had low levels on peer approval of forced sex at the end of their freshman year and at the senior year, which would be what we would expect. The blue line is the persistently high group, and we would expect them to have the highest levels on peer approval of forced sex than the other groups, and that would be in freshman and senior year. But what's most interesting are these 2 lines that cross. This purple line is our increasing sexual assault risk group, and what we saw was that corresponding with that, at their freshman year, they had relatively lower levels of peer approval of forced sex, but that increased by their senior year, and that risk factor increase corresponded with their increased risk for sexual assault, and conversely, an opposite pattern for the decreasing risk group. And then similarly with peer pressure for sex, a very similar pattern emerged where the low sexual assault risk group had consistently low levels of peer pressure for sex, and the high-risk group had consistently high levels of peer pressure for sex, and then a similar pattern for the decreasing and increasing trajectory groups, whereas their risk for sexual aggression changed that corresponded with a change in this risk factor for peer pressure for sex. And then rape-supportive beliefs, this is a slightly different pattern. The sample as a whole was decreasing on their rape-supportive attitudes, but this risk reduction was the strongest for our decreasing sexual assault risk group, which would be what we had hypothesized, that one of the reasons perhaps they were decreasing in their sexual assault risk is they were showing concomitant decreases in their rape-supportive beliefs. And so I think what those data indicate was that there is heterogeneity among sexual aggression perpetrators, and that the likelihood of sexual aggression can change during college. It's not like once someone perpetrates that they're always going to be a perpetrator. So the notion of a serial perpetrator has some evidence for a small group of people, but for the majority, not so. And then it also suggests that peer norms and rape-supportive beliefs are important targets for intervention, because we were able to see that those were malleable risk factors, modifiable risk factors, I think as Sarah referred to them as, and that if you could modify those, you could perhaps see, we saw that changes in them over time corresponded with the change in perpetration risk. And so I think that these data suggest that programs need to address these changing risk factors throughout the college years. A lot of college programming will happen like right when students get to campus, and I think that that is important to educate them on sexual assault prevention. But for a couple of reasons, I think it's important to think about booster sessions throughout the college years. I think they're inundated when they first get to campus, so there's only so much information they can take in, but they're also not yet immersed in the college culture. And so some of these things that we're talking about in terms of peer norms really don't have much salience to them yet. And so doing some focus groups with students about some of the timing for when we might be doing booster sessions, perhaps the beginning of their second semester of their freshman year might be a good time to reintroduce some of our prevention programming. And then I think also sort of a one-size-fits-all approach may not be as useful as thinking about what risk groups need what risk groups need attention to what risk factors. So with primary prevention, I think that efforts could be focusing on risk factors that were associated with that increasing trajectory group, because we were able to see that as changes on those risk factors increased over time, that some males without a history of sexual assault perpetration to college increased their perpetration likelihood. So to the extent that we can keep those risk factors, stop those risk factors from increasing, we could perhaps stop that increasing sexual assault trajectory from increasing. And then interventions designed to decrease rape supportive beliefs and negative peer norms can lead to decreased risk for sexual aggression among men who've already engaged in sexual aggressive behaviors. And so what needs to be done? I think that I feel like we really need more longitudinal studies to be able to replicate some of this, to see how variable is sexual aggression risk, what are other risk factors that might change during the college years that predict these different changes in sexual aggression risk. I think one of the talks already talked about prevention programs that target these modifiable risk factors. There's certain risk factors that we know are risk factors for sexual assault, like child sexual abuse, but those are things that we're not going to really be able to change once they're in college, and so targeting things that we perhaps can change, that we can see that a reduction actually results in a reduction in the sexual assault. And then I think we've also heard this throughout some of the talks today. We really know very little about social and community level risk factors and what factors at that level, both at the college campus level and then just broader than that, what might increase or decrease risk for sexual assault perpetration. So that's it for me.
I was just wondering about the data collection that you used for the surveys for the men. I don't know if you remember the exact phrasing used, but I find it hard to imagine that a guy would say, yep, I raped X number of women this year. Can you talk a little bit more about how you got that data?
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think our rates would have been much lower had we asked that question. And so I think that's one of the great things about the Sexual Experiences Survey, is it uses very behaviorally specific questions and doesn't use terms like rape. And same with female victims. I think if you were to ask them if they had been raped, you would have a much lower prevalence than if you ask these behaviorally specific questions where they're acknowledging behaviors that would meet the legal definition of rape, but they themselves would not have labeled it that way. So we did use the Sexual Experiences Survey, and it was not an anonymous survey because we had to link their surveys over time. And so was somewhat concerned. We did get a certificate of confidentiality from NIH and had to go through a full IRB review on our campus. But I was surprised, that there was that much acknowledgement of sexual behaviors that would meet the definition of rape. And I think just using measurement tools that were validated, and then trying to ensure them of the confidentiality of the data.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. They're interrelated. In your research, did you find any data with same-sex sexual aggression perpetration? And then also the involuntary celibate culture, I guess, how could we discern that from your data in terms of your graphs?
Yeah, we unfortunately did not look at same-sex. So this was specific to violence perpetrated by males on females. We did have a question about the virginity pledge in our study, and we did find it was protective. So that was the only thing we were able to look at in terms of the celibate culture. But we did find the more partners they had, the higher the risk of perpetration.
Hi. I was just wondering if you know of any information out there about students entering college and their history of sex education, if they had any formal sex education, the quality and quantity of that, and then like sources of informal sex education, like, you know, peer sources or pornography, and how that might influence their ideas of what sex is and what sex isn't, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I know in terms of pornography, we found, and we did assess that in our study, and that was a significant risk factor for perpetration, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. The question about what type of programming they had before they got to college, we didn't ask that, and I think that's a great question, because I think students coming to campus now have had so much more exposure than when, you know, certainly 10 or 20 years ago, students coming. So we've tried to start to add that. We have a program that our students do when they get to campus that combines sexual assault prevention and mental health promotion and high-risk drinking prevention. So we've added a question about that, but even so, we were only able to add like one question and not get at specifics, like, you know, how much of it they got or what type they got. But I think that would be really interesting to see how what they got before they came impacted their risk.
We can go ahead and move on.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson.
Sure.